Okay. Well, thank you, friends and comrades, for coming tonight. Glad you could all make it here for this discussion on inflation and the party's rollback prices campaign. Um, Before we begin, I'll acknowledge that in the various parts of Alberta, we're on the territories of Treaty 6, 7, and 8 in the various different parts of the province. But the Communist Party acknowledges that these treaties were not negotiated in good faith by the British Crown or maintained in good faith by the Canadian state, which is the successor government, and that Indigenous peoples have a right to self-government. We support their rights and their struggle for self-determination, self-government on their own lands, and free and uncoerced consent for any development or the use of the resources of their land, or the use of the resources in surrounding territories, in surrounding areas that impacts their land. So tonight's presentation is basically talking about inflation. I'm going to now share the screen. Okay. So the go-to policy and technique of the bourgeoisie and the state that represents its interests in the face of inflation is to make the working class pay, is to raise interest rates, deliberately attempting to reduce investment, reduce employment, and use this to beat down wages. And this is their basic go-to response to the problem of inflation. Now, naturally, we don't think that this is necessarily the best way of doing it. Our response is, in fact, just the opposite. And so that's essentially what the rest of this presentation is about. So we'll look at, I'm going to try to focus on like three aspects of bourgeois theories about inflation and what's wrong with them. One of them is treating the consequences of their actions as if they were forces of nature that were outside their control. The second major point is that blaming the working class. In other words, claiming that rising wages causes inflation, and that therefore the only way to defeat inflation is to push down wages. And the third is to just touch a little bit on generally about monetarist gobbledygook, like the theories that the bourgeoisie has developed to attempt to explain inflation and to justify this policy. So if bourgeoisie has several explanations of inflation, of what causes inflation. And as far as they go, it's true, these causes do in fact cause inflation. But generally speaking, they do not look any further than to look at what is the cause of these causes. The first one is what's referred to as cost push, which is when the prices of inputs increases. So the prices of raw materials or energy, of course, is a big one. If the price of fossil fuels goes up, that has ramifications all through the economy. Supply chain disruptions can fall under this category. But these are not acts of God. These are problems which arise from how they, in fact, manage the economy and their policies. So, the supply chain disruption problem is a good example of this. I mean, it really did expose the fragility of the whole global network of trade. And, during COVID, it became apparent that maybe maximum efficiency isn't really the most efficient thing. Maybe we actually need more resiliency built into the system to account for difficulties. This is the typical, it's like the Jaws movie scenario of capitalism, where somebody could tell you quite clearly that there's a problem. Somebody could tell you that this problem is going to happen, but where warnings are just ignored until the disaster actually does happen. Another account of the cause of inflation is demand driven. This is the mantra that they taught us in Economics 200. They've been repeating it for generations now, that inflation is caused by too much money chasing too few goods. Well, this is a description, but it in fact doesn't really explain anything, because why is that money too much money, and why are there too few goods? And of course, it really is just a backhanded way of saying that it's the working class that has too much money, not ever looking at whether it's the capitalists who have too much money. We'll look at this in much more detail. A third cause is built-in expectations. This is where a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, where if companies anticipate that their costs, in fact, are going to increase, they will also raise their prices in that expectation. And this, of course, continues to fuel a cycle of inflation. But of course, this can only happen if those companies are already in something of a monopoly position, because if it was completely, purely competitive capitalism, and they really were under the uh, uh, control of market forces, if the market forces were controlling them, then they wouldn't be able to increase prices. So there's already an implicit assumption built into this that they do have some control over their pricing. And another explanation is what's called externalities, which is factors that are not strictly economic but have an impact on the economy. This could be wars, disasters, acts of God. So they, in fact, may be external to the economy, strictly speaking, but they're not external to the policies of governments, and the class interests that they represent. I mean, governments choose war. Governments impose sanctions. These are not just, things like a meteor hitting the earth. And they, in fact, even choose, they've deliberately refrained from combating climate change. So even supposed natural disasters, heat waves, floods, crop failures, there's a large fires, there's a large factor of chosen policies that are treated or explained away by the bourgeois economics as externalities. So, but okay, the main thing, though, of blaming workers' wages, is what I want to focus on now. Well, for one thing, generally speaking, workers' wages aren't always rising at the beginning of a period of inflation. More often, there's an increased urgency of wage demands as a response to inflation, not a cause. And okay, the argument that if wages go up, companies will just increase their prices, and therefore there's no point in workers asking for more higher wages. It will just be eaten up by higher prices. This is not a new argument. I'm going to switch over to a different screen here for a moment. Oh, sorry, I actually lost it. Okay, this is not a new argument. Marx actually addressed this very question in 1865. There's a very interesting little book called Value, Prices, and Profits. Okay, so if you Google value, price, and profit, and even actually go to the Wikipedia entry for it, it's actually surprisingly good, an unbiased presentation about what that book really is about, what it says. It's a relatively short one. It's based on a couple of lectures that Marx gave in 1865 to the International Working Men's Association. And in it, basically, he oh, I see Adam says that the Club Red is currently reading it. Yes, well, it is really current for us to read to understand this particular argument, to refute this particular argument about the, whether workers really should abandon the struggle for higher wages. So from the Marxist point of view, wages generally reflect the value of labor power as a commodity. And the value of a commodity is the socially necessary labor time required to produce it. So in the case of producing labor power, we're talking about the time required to produce the commodities that would support the labor and enable them to reproduce, to keep the working class going. Now, since workers actually work for longer than that, more hours than what's actually required to produce those bare necessities, they're producing surplus value, which is the capitalist profit. So now wages can't be increased to be the full value of what the workers produce. Because if wages really were that high, there wouldn't even, in fact, be any capitalist profit. There wouldn't be a surplus remaining available to be reinvested. So this, in fact, would obviously create its own problems. But there's a really broad range of possible shares of the production between wages and profit. There's a very broad range in between real starvation wages and at the bottom and zero profits at the top. And social and cultural factors come into play to redefine what's considered necessary, a standard of living that's necessary to maintain the laborers and to allow them to reproduce. Now, capitalists in general will not scruple to reduce the value of, or reduce wages below the value which in fact can sustain the working class and enable it to to raise the next generation. So I'm going to I've got to go back to so it inadvertently closed the PowerPoint. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to open this up again. Okay. Okay, so if I go back and share this again, my apologies. So we don't seem to get through one of these without a glitch. So you may have seen this before. This is a graph of the columns. The first numerical column is what the minimum wage was about a year ago, October 2022, in various cities in Canada. The second column shows you what the minimum wage what a wage would have to be to enable that wage recipient to rent a one-bedroom apartment, assuming that the rent's not going to gobble up their entire pay packet, that the rents are at about 35%. And then the third column shows what it would cost for a two-bedroom apartment in those cities, or what wage they would have to make to be able to afford it. So as you can see, like, Toronto, they'd have to double the minimum wage for a person to even be able to afford an apartment. They'd have to almost triple it for them to be able to afford a two-bedroom apartment. So this is essentially saying that people can't afford to have kids in these cities on minimum wage. So it's a pretty striking sort of aspect of that capitalists don't feel actually obliged to maintain wages at the level that will allow the working class to not just live, but reproduce. So these, okay, so going back to the question of whether companies would simply increase their prices when, if workers' wages go up, and therefore swallow up any benefit, negate any benefit workers would get from rising wages. Well, essentially, whether a company can increase its prices and still sell its product is an independent variable from the level of wages. If they're in a monopoly position, they're very likely to raise their prices, even if wages remain steady or go down. So this is where we can now talk for a bit about the money supply. This sort of notion of too much money, the too much money chasing too few goods. This is basically this is a sort of a core concept of monetarism as a theory, which is essentially, it has been referred to as voodoo economics. It's really, bears no relationship to what really goes on in the economy. It's entirely a justification for an attack on the working class and the maximization of corporate profits. So what would too much money mean? Like if there's more money, if the banks create more money, is this necessarily inflationary? Well, no, it depends on the circumstances. It partly depends on who gets the money and what they do with it. It's not inflationary if the money is actually lent to productive capitalists, if it's used to actually bring unused potential into production. So if there really are capitalists out there who would still invest productively, and if there's still potentially productive uses for capital, creating new money would not be inflationary. It would actually contribute to the growth of the economy as a whole. It would create more wealth to correspond to the increase in the money supply. Also, if the new money created is just simply put into the hands of the poorest people and marginalized people, this is, generally speaking, would not be inflationary, because these poor people will use it to pay for necessities. And, generally speaking, the impact of that would be to extend the length of the business cycle, would be to stave off the crisis of overproduction that, which comes around regularly when essentially workers become more productive than they can receive wages for, when production outpaces the capacity of people to buy the products. So putting more money into the hands of the poorer people, in fact, staves off that crisis of relative overproduction. So nonetheless, it's the default solution of bourgeois economists and their policymakers is to raise interest rates, which deliberately discourages investment, deliberately reducing employment. And then they use unemployment to discipline the working class, to defeat wage demands, and probably incidentally to smash unions altogether if they can get away with it.
My entire life, wages have stagnated. Well, real wages.
Okay.
You're born at the beginning.
Okay, Ukrainian Center, can you turn off your mic, please? Okay, sorry. Okay, so but what's actually really going on is our wage, is there too much money? Well, let's look at this. Let's look at some graphs about this. Well, I'm going to give this graph shows you something, where I'll give you a pocket history of the economy since World War II. Let's say this graph starts in 1948. So at the end of World War II, the capitalism in the imperialist countries really needed to stave off the threat of socialism. Like there was a high prestige of the Soviet Union, of our brave Russian allies at the end of the war. There was the expansion of the territory, of the socialist territories, with the eastern part of Europe having been liberated by the Soviets, and of course the Chinese Revolution. These things really did strike fear into the hearts of the capitalists. And there was additionally, there was, they understood that there was pent-up demand for improved conditions after the deprivations of wartime from the populations of the European and North American countries. And there was a rise in the national liberation movements, the anti-colonial movement of countries seeking independence. Again, these things all broke out. The working class and the colonial peoples generally thought that they were entitled to their share as a reward for having, taken part in the war and defeated fascism. So they struck a kind of a deal. It wasn't made official, but there was a policy of bourgeois governments to, one part of it was the welfare state, to actually provide some decent services. And another was that to provide decent wages. So if you look at this graph here, this is productivity to wages. Start in the first half of the graph from 1948 to 73. As productivity went up, hourly wages went up almost exactly in lockstep. The graph is, those two lines are essentially the same. Then you see in 1973, they start to diverge. Well, what happened? 73, 74, there was the oil embargo, where the OPEC countries cut off oil to the US, the immediate cause being American support of Israel. Oh, but also, this was the period when the expense of the war of aggression against Vietnam was beginning to impact the American economy. And the US was still such a dominant factor in the whole world economy that this inflationary spiral spread, became a global phenomenon. And at this point, though, they had the capitalist class was actually, I think, probably confident that it was winning the Cold War ideological battle. They'd been capable of turning around the attitude of the working class, with the sort of bugbear of anti-communism. They succeeded in smashing the communist leadership of the unions, certainly in Canada and the US. And the unions had become quite subservient to American foreign policy interests. And they become the sort of business unions that we know and deplore today. So they didn't have so much to fear. So a combination of inventing an excuse for it, the election of neoliberal governments like US and Britain leading the way with Thatcher and Reagan being elected, and using the World Bank and the IMF as global tools, they instituted a new policy. And it initiated, this decades-long period where wages essentially remained stagnant no matter how much productivity increased. So we can see there are several more graphs that Miguel has supplied to us. So this is one that, again, this is American, but it reflects an international trend. This is real GDP and median male income. Now, women's incomes is, in fact, even in even worse conditions. So again, here you can see that they kept step, the actual growth in the GDP, the growth of the economy as a whole, up to about 1975, and then they start to diverge, where incomes remain stagnant as the economy grows and grows. Here's another one, household debt in Canada. Now, the headline from Statistics Canada is that household debt decreased from 22 to 23. Well, that's good, but the point is that if we look at the longer range picture, the debt has increased and increased steadily and significantly. This is debt as a percentage of gross income. So what this is saying is that people owe almost like 2 years worth of their income in debt. And here's a picture of global debt, quarterly, first quarter of 2012 to the first quarter of 2019. So it's a little older, but a similar picture. And here's the corresponding, line that you would expect to see going down, US household savings in relation to disposable income. So again, from 1981 to 2006, the line goes downward as the debt line went upward, as the economy improved, but the wages remained stagnant. And here is another one. This is the ratio of total household wealth to national income. The dark brown line being the top 0.1%, not the top 1%, but the top 0.1%. And then the orange line being the bottom 90%. And you can see this is a longer range graph. You can see it starts in 1913. So you can actually see a picture of what happened to the ultra wealthy and to the wealth inequality through the 20s into the 30s. The shock of the First World War is in the first downward trend in the brown line. You can see that they shot up again during the 20s and started to dwindle in the 30s. Again, a downward trend for this during the Second World War. That long period of relative stability leading up to, during that period of wages keeping pace with productivity gains. And now then it starts to go up again until we've now reached the stage where the bottom 90% and the top 0.1% are about equal in wealth, total wealth, which is about the condition that we were in about 100 years ago. So now this one is a truly shocking picture. This one is income growth during expansionary periods. That is the boom part of an economy, when you would actually expect, that productivity is going up. You would expect some of inflation. You expect wages to go up. So if we look at the first one here, the top 10%, the top 10% is the orangey red line. So the top 10% got 20% of the income growth in that first post-war boom, which is more than their share, but sort of what you would expect. But as you see, as you go along through the different business cycles, the orange line is getting higher and higher and the blue line, which is the share of the bottom 90%, is going down and down. You get to the right-hand side, the most recent change in the share distribution of income growth, the blue line, it actually goes down from 0. So in the last boom, the share of the bottom 90% actually decreased. So I think we can say that, that wages have not driven inflation over this period. And even the IMF, who was in fact one of the factors that drove this increasing economic inequality through this whole past 30, 40 years, has finally grudgingly admitted that this is the case, that increasing the share of the bottom 2% of citizens by a mere 1% results in a 0.38% jump in GDP growth. By contrast, increasing the share of the top 20% yields a decline in growth. So we've reached the point where even the mainstream media are recognizing that there's runaway corporate profits in this period of inflation. And as we know, like even the government of Canada has had to acknowledge that they've had the corporate heads of the grocery monopolies called them on the carpet, and essentially they've threatened them that if they don't voluntarily do something about this inflation, that the government's going to be forced to take action. So now we know that what this means from the Liberal government point of view is that they're warning the corporations that they'll be better off if they make at least a show of pulling back prices rather than having to face actual explicit government controls. But of course, we have a campaign where we call for just that, a rollback of prices on food, fuel, and rent. Now, we've actually all been involved in this campaign, handing out the leaflets, and so our campaign essentially is really just the opposite of the bourgeois policy of making the working class shoulder the burden and suffer the sacrifices to deal with inflation. One of the slogans that's on our leaflet says, "One job should be enough." So it's important for us to remember that when we talk about demanding a rollback of prices, is that it's in the context that we have other demands as well. We want to shift the whole balance of forces of the two classes in the economic sphere and in the social and political sphere. So besides talking about rolling back prices on food, fuel, and rent, we talk about this in the context of also fighting to raise wages, to increase the stock of social housing, to reinstitute and expand social benefits, like such things as eliminating tuition fees, having pharmacare, subsidizing daycare, things like that, and redistributing the tax burden, because a large element of that divergence of corporate profits from wages that we saw in all those graphs was that the burden of taxation was shifted more and more to the income taxes of individuals and away from corporate profits. I didn't put up a graph about that in particular, but this is a really significant factor. In the first post-war boom, which was a boom, right? Corporate taxes in Canada were on corporate taxes on profits was at about 50%. Of course, they were allowed to reinvest profits and therefore not pay taxes on it. But this is in fact what this was the result that the government actually wanted, reinvestment. So, but gradually over time, and since the 70s, since that change in policy, and increasingly and continuously over time, continually have whittled away at the level of taxation of corporate profits. In Alberta, of course, another big factor is whittling away at the level of royalty payments for natural resources. So these are, this is an important part of redressing the balance of forces between the classes, is to redistribute the tax burden. And that's also part of our policy. And of course, another big part of it is to fight to reverse that generations-long ideological and political decline of the labor movement, so that the labor movement will actually take up its role of carrying out this campaign and preparing for future battles. So I think I'm going to just leave it there and throw it open for general discussion.
Can we ask questions directly? Do we have to go through chat?
Well,
we can just do hands maybe, and I can pick people. And then the other thing is, do you want to keep the recording going, or do you want to stop it?
I guess we can. Sorry, I guess we can stop the recording at this point. Yeah. Okay.